Go ahead and open your Bibles up to the book of Lamentations. Right there after Jeremiah. Studied through Jeremiah last year, I guess it was, that we spent a good part of the year going through Jeremiah. And we didn't look at Lamentations after we had finished Jeremiah. I had said that we would come back to that at some point in the future, and so today is the future. And we're going to look at the entire book of Lamentations in one lesson today. And so it's more of an overview of the book. The book itself doesn't name its author, but Jewish tradition holds that it is the work of Jeremiah. It's set next to the book of Jeremiah in our Bible. In a Hebrew Bible, it's not in the same space where it is in ours. In ours, it would be really Jeremiah. The book of Jeremiah is while the threat of the Babylonians coming in and the captivity is on the horizon and beginning to happen, the book of Lamentations is written after the fact. It's taken place. And so this is now the lamentation of Jeremiah, having seen what took place in the land. 5 chapters in the book, and it's a series of 5 laments focused on Jerusalem and its fall. The 5 laments are actually 5 poems. The way that they're set up, they are poems, each having 22 verses, which is it's a acrostic poem. Each stanza takes a Hebrew, a letter out of the Hebrew alphabet. And so if we were doing that in English, first stanza would start with A, second stanza would start with B, third stanza would start with C, and so forth. Well, they use the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet as they go through. And so chapters 1 through 4 are that way, are acrostic. Chapter 5 is not, still has 22 verses in it, but it's not acrostic in its nature. The 5 chapters really break down in this fashion. Chapter 1 is about the desolate city. Chapter 2 focuses on God's wrath, which was against them. Chapter 3 is seeking or pursuing God's mercy. Chapter 4 comes back to the horror of the siege. And then chapter 5 closes out with seeking restoration. And so that's the focus through the book. And obviously, with there being 5 chapters in the book, we're not going to give a detailed account of each chapter today, but we do want to focus on the key concepts and verses as we go through the book. And so in chapter 1, and the Hebrews don't actually call it Lamentations, they call it How. As is commonly the place with the Hebrew books, Genesis is called beginning because that's the first word of the book. And here, this book is actually referred to as How, which is the first word in the book. But chapter 1 is a lament about the destruction of Jerusalem. And so we see that portrayed for us in verse 1, how lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow is she, who was great among the nations. The princes among the provinces have become a slave. And so here, this once vibrant and full of life city now lays desolate. Jerusalem is empty. In verse 3, we're told Judah has gone into captivity. Verse 4, the roads of Zion mourn because no one comes to the set feast. Remember, all the feasts would be in Jerusalem, and all the Jews would flock to Jerusalem for the feast. Nobody comes for the set feast. All her gates are desolate. And he addresses the cause for all this, why there's such devastation. Verse 5, the Lord has afflicted her because of the multitude of her transgressions. And again in verse 8, Jerusalem has sinned gravely, therefore she has become vile. It's not that this just happened to take place. So there's a reason. It's because of their sin and the fact that they would not turn from sin. And so desolation can't come upon a city without touching the lives of the inhabitants. And so in chapter 1, there's a huge focus on how this has affected people. Verse 5, her children have gone into captivity before the enemy. Verse 15, the Lord has trampled underfoot all my mighty men. There was a time when the Israelites would go to war, and they would come back from war without suffering a single casualty. Now the Lord is trampling underfoot the mighty men of Jerusalem and of Judah. Verse 16, my children are desolate because the enemy has prevailed. Verse 18, the Lord is righteous. For I rebelled against his commandments. Now Jeremiah is writing on behalf of the city, on behalf of all of Judah. Jeremiah didn't rebel, but Judah did, and Jerusalem did. And so he acknowledges, verse 18, the Lord's righteous. I rebelled against his commandments. Hear now, all peoples, and behold my sorrow. My virgins and my young men have gone into captivity. Verse 19, the priests and the elders have breathed their last. They've all died in the city. Verse 20, I have been very rebellious outside. The sword bereaves at home. It is like death. And so those who tried to escape the city, they would be put to death by the sword. Those who remained in the city, there was a stench of death throughout the city because of the siege that was taking place. And so it affected the people drastically. And when God's people are determined to walk contrary to his law, then the end result is that there is no comfort. And again, that's one of the focuses that we see over and over in chapter 1. Back at verse 2, among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. Now, what he's talking about when he refers to her lovers, these are the pagan nations that Judah allied herself with and thought, well, if I have them as an ally, one of them was Egypt. That was one of the major ones that they allied themselves with. If Egypt is on board with us, then surely Babylon won't defeat us. Babylon defeated Egypt and Judah. And Egypt did not come to the defense of Judah. And so there's no comfort, it says in verse 2. Again in verse 16, the comforter who should restore my life is far from me. Now keep in mind, Jeremiah is writing on behalf of the entire nation, not just specifically himself. And so in verse 16, when it talks about the comforter who should restore my life, unfortunately, it's a reference to those allies. It's a reference to Egypt and to Ethiopia and to the other nations that they thought would be on board with fighting against Babylon with them. Her allies were far from her, that they didn't come to Judah's defense. Now, let's think about verse 16 in the way that it ought to be, in the mindset Judah should have had. The comforter, God, that's who the true comforter should have been for them. Who should restore my life is far from me. They were far from God. It's not that God moved. God didn't move anywhere. They had moved away from him. But Judah was seeking comfort in the wrong place. Verse 17, Zion spreads out her hands, but no one comforts her. And so she's beckoning for her allies to come and to save her, but they all, in fact, became her enemies. And then again in verse 21, they have heard that I sigh, but no one comforts me. Again, all the allies, actually, when they heard of the troubles going on in Judah, they were glad. They actually rejoiced in the trials that Judah was going through. And so chapter 1 gives this focus on Jerusalem and how desolate it is, how it affected the people when the captivity came upon them, and the fact that there was no comfort for the nation. In chapter 2 is a lament about God's wrath, which was poured out upon his people. It begins in this way: how the Lord has covered the daughters of Zion with a cloud in his anger. They have enraged God because of their sin. And this chapter 2, focuses on God's anger with his people. Verse 1, he covered them with this cloud of his anger. Verse 1 again, he did not remember his footstool in the day of his anger. Verse 2, the Lord has swallowed up and has not pitied. Verse 2 again, he has thrown down in his wrath the stronghold of the daughters of Jerusalem. Verse 3, he has cut off in his fierce anger every horn of Israel. Still in verse 3, he has blazed against Jacob in a flaming fire, devouring all around. Verse 4, he has poured out his fury like fire. Verse 5, he has swallowed up Israel. Verse 6, in his burning indignation, he has spurned the king and the priest. Down to verse 17, he has thrown down and not pitied. Verse 21, you have slaughtered and not pitied. Verse 22, in the day of the Lord's anger, there was no refugee or survivor. Chapter 2 focuses on the wrath of God. He is angry with his people. Now, in addition to these words like anger and wrath and fury and indignation, there are several other words used in this chapter to describe God's actions towards Jerusalem and Judah in response to their perpetual rebellion and transgression. Take a look at verse 4. Verse 4, he bent his bow against them like an adversary. Verse 6, he's done violence to the tabernacle. Verse 7, he abandoned the sanctuary. Verse 8, the Lord has purposed to destroy the wall. And so again, the purpose of the chapter is to show the degree of wrath that God had against his people and in fact against his city, such that he would destroy them and it. Jeremiah was very descriptive when he talks about the destruction that came upon Jerusalem. He doesn't just pass it by and well, you know, the city was destroyed. The physical city, he talks about how there was fire throughout the city, how it was broken, how the walls were torn down. He refers to the spiritual service and how it just stopped. Again, chapter 1, nobody comes to the appointed feast. The Sabbaths were forgotten. And then the people were despondent, they were ill, they were starving. Verse 10 talks about the elders and the virgins alike who sat there with their heads to the ground in sackcloth and ashes. And of course, when people in the Old Testament had sackcloth and ashes, the idea was mourning. They were mourning about what was going on. The problem was their mourning did not also involve repentance. They weren't turning away from sin. They were just mourning about the bad things that were happening to them and wishing that that would stop, but not willing to turn away from sin. Verse 11, Jeremiah describes himself as being sick. He says, my bile is poured out on the ground. It's unspeakable to think about what was going on in Jerusalem and how devastating it was. He saw sights that just made him sick to his stomach. And so that's why he says in verse 11, my bile is poured out on the ground. He was throwing up because of the things that he was seeing. Verse 12, children were asking their mothers for food. There was no food. There was a siege around the city. Babylon had closed her in, and there was nothing coming in and nothing going out. And so eventually they would have no food at all within the city limits. Verse 14, and this is perhaps the saddest part of chapter 2. Verse 14, it talks about what the prophets are doing. And so your prophets have seen for you false and deceptive visions. They have not uncovered your iniquity to bring back your captives, but have envisioned for you false prophecies and delusions. The city has fallen apart around them. The temple service is no more because the temple is no more. And yet there's still some false prophets who are going around preaching hope. Well, you know, maybe tomorrow things will be better. And he says it's delusion that they're preaching to the people. They still prophesied falsely. And so towards the end of chapter 2, we've got this statement, verse 20 and 21. See, O Lord, and consider, to whom have you done this? Should the women eat their offspring, the children they have cuddled? Should the priest and the prophet be slain in the sanctuary of the Lord, young and old lie on the ground in the streets? Lord, have you not considered who you're doing this to? And I don't think that this is Jeremiah's cry. I think this is the cry of the city. Jeremiah knows exactly why all this is taking place. He spent year after year preaching to them, warning them that this was going to take place if they didn't turn back to the Lord. And so this is the cry of the people, not the cry of Jeremiah. Jeremiah knew very well that this was going to happen. In fact, just a few verses before that, verse 17, the Lord has done what he purposed. He has fulfilled his word, which he commanded in days of old. God said he was going to do this if they didn't turn back. And not just during the time of Jeremiah, and other prophets were there as well in and around that time. Not just the things that Jeremiah was saying, but remember, we studied not too long ago the law of Moses, and we saw that there was warnings given to the people. Deuteronomy chapter 28, you serve the Lord and all these blessings will be upon you, and you turn away from the Lord and all these curses will be upon you. And that's what they were going through, was the curses. And among the curses, as you kept going, and they got worse and worse as you go through the list. But among them, eventually, it talked about how they would be removed from the land, how they would be enduring famine, and even to the point where, as the complaint of the people is, should women eat their offspring? The law actually said that that would end up happening because of their sin if they wouldn't turn back to God. And so it's not as though they weren't warned. They knew what the result of sin is. The problem was the people didn't believe God. They didn't believe Jeremiah. They didn't believe Isaiah. They didn't believe any of the prophets as they were coming and warning them. They didn't believe Moses. It was first recorded in Moses. They didn't believe what God said. And then when God does what he said he would do, Lord, have you not considered who you're doing this to? The Lord had considered who he was doing it to. The Lord has done what he purposed. He has fulfilled the word which was commanded in days of old. Sin is ugly. You know, folks need to realize that. We need to understand that. Sin is ugly, and often the results of sin are even uglier. And that's what they were enduring. Chapter 3. Chapter 3 begins by saying, I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. Chapter 3 is a lament about God's wrath, but it also focuses on the need for them to seek God's mercy. The first 20 verses of chapter 3 acknowledge the awful place where the nation sin had brought them. Now, I had said earlier that we've got acrostic poetry here and 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. If you look at chapter 3 actually has 66 verses to it. And so each stanza is comprised of 3 verses rather than 1. And so stanza 1 is verse 1 through 3. That's the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And then stanza 4 through 6, that's the second one, and so on. And so it still fits the same pattern as the other chapters. But in these first 20 verses, it talks about how awful the awful place where a nation's sins would bring them. Verse 1 through 3, there's going to be affliction and darkness because of sin. Verse 4 through 6, things are going to be worn out and broken and next to dead because of sin. Verse 7 through 9, The people themselves, the nation, are going to be blocked. They're going to be hedged in. They're going to be shut out. They're going to have crooked paths because of sin. Verse 10 through 12, they would be besieged. There would be a siege set around the city. They would be torn into pieces because of sin. Verse 13 through 15, they would be ridiculed and they would be filled with bitterness because of their sin. Verse 16 through 18, they would be broken. They would be far from peace. They would be without prosperity. All of this comes back to their sin. That's what's caused this. Verse 19 and 20, they would be afflicted and they would be roaming. And so he paints a very sad picture. But then look at verse 21. He says, then I recall to my mind, or this I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. He says there's reason for hope. The structure of chapter 3 reminds me of Psalm 22. And in Psalm 22, the psalmist goes through, and it's a messianic psalm. And he talks about all the oppression and all the difficulties and so forth that were coming upon him. And then as you get partway through the psalm, verse 21, after talking about the lion's mouth and the horns of the wild beast and the dogs that surround and all these bad things that are going on, verse 21, you have answered me. He says, God has heard me. And here in Lamentations chapter 3, it's sort of the same way in verse 21. Verse 1 through 20 are all these bad things, all the results of sin. And then verse 21, he says, there's hope. Even in the midst of all this, there is hope. And so notice what he says then, verse 22 through 26. He says, through the Lord's mercies, we are not consumed. Now, where do you start in their position to focus on hope? We're not dead. We're not all dead. But through the Lord's mercy, we are not consumed because his compassions fail not. Think about the setting of this. Jeremiah is looking around at a city that is destroyed. He sees a temple that is no longer standing. He sees walls that have collapsed. He sees dead people laying in the city. There's no food. There's crying everywhere. And yet in the midst of all that, he's able to say, through the Lord's mercies, we're not consumed. Not all of us. And his compassions do not fail. They are new every morning. Imagine getting up every morning in Jerusalem at that time. It would be disturbing. It'd make you sad to get up. But Jeremiah writes, the compassion of God and his mercies are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I hope in him. I can't hope in what's around me. This world is falling apart. Therefore, I hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him. Now, this is the key in the text. He's not saying this to the person out there who's continuing in sin. The mercies of the Lord are not upon that one, and the compassion of the Lord is not there for that one. But he says, the Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. Just picture Jeremiah surrounded by destruction, and this is what is on his mind. God is still good. God is still good, and he's going to bring about good. It would have been just for God to destroy the entire nation. But he didn't. There would be a remnant that would be saved. In fact, remember when we studied in Jeremiah had told the people, don't fight against being led captive to Babylon. It's God's will that you go to Babylon. That was what he told them. And some of them fought, and you know what happened when they fought? They were killed. And those who didn't fight Well, we've got Daniel. Daniel made a good life for himself in Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego made good lives for themselves in Babylon. In fact, Jeremiah told them, go and live there and buy houses and have families. Because we need to grow up again. We need to have a nation again to come back to rebuild 70 years later. Mordecai and Esther, they're at the end of that time frame, but they're in well-established families. And so God will be good for those, or good to those who will wait upon him and who will seek him. And Jeremiah is encouraging them to do so. But think about how exceptional this is to be able to express thanksgiving and faith in the midst of that kind of trial. The city was still destroyed. The people were still dying. The enemies were still mocking. But Jeremiah looked beyond all that, and he saw the goodness of God. The key, again, in this text, towards the end of it, verse 26, it is good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of God. Be focused on the things of God. Hope in him, wait for him, seek him. Verse 32, Lamentations chapter 32, or 30, chapter 3, verse 32. Lamentations 3, verse 32. He says, though he causes grief, yet he will show compassion according to the multitude of his mercies. For he does not afflict willingly, nor grieve the children of men. Think about that. Remember, we had the people in chapter 2 and verse 20 saying, Lord, consider who you're doing this to. It's us, it's your people, right? Why are you punishing your people this way? Verse 33 of chapter 3, he doesn't afflict willingly. You think God wanted to do this? You think God wanted to destroy his people, wanted to tear down the temple, wanted to destroy the wall of Jerusalem? This is where he set his name among the nations. And so he's not doing this because he wants to do this. He's doing this because of how sinful they had become. Remember back in the days of Noah, do you think God wanted to flood the entire earth in the days of Noah? That wasn't what he wanted to do. He would have loved to have seen the people turn their hearts to change and them decide that they're going to serve the Lord instead of serve themselves. And so he doesn't do it willingly. When somebody's cast into hell, when the judgment comes, God finds no glory or greatness in that. It's a measure of justice. But God does not glory in it. God wants people to turn. That message is found throughout the scriptures, Old Testament, New Testament. God wants people to turn to him and live. Jeremiah says there's hope. Down a little bit further, verse 39 through 42. Why should a living man complain, a man for the punishment of his sins? Let us search out and examine our ways and turn back to the Lord. Let us lift our hearts and hands to God in heaven. We have transgressed and rebelled. You have not pardoned. Jeremiah's thought in verse 39, shall one who is in sin complain about the punishment for the sin? When if we're out on the highway and we're traveling down the road at 130 kilometers an hour and a police officer pulls us over, do you really have a right to complain about the ticket he just gave you? We might do it, but come on now. We earned it. We're the one who did the deed in order to get the ticket. Same thing here. Shall one complain about the punishment for his sin? The more profitable solution would be to examine ourselves. That's what Paul told the Corinthians. He said of himself that he buffets his body daily to make sure that he doesn't present himself as disqualified, that he's doing what he preaches. But then when he writes to them again in the 2 Corinthian letter, chapter 13 and verse 5, he says, examine yourselves. He wants them to see, are you in the faith or are you disqualified? That's Jeremiah's message here. Let's examine ourselves. Let's see where we've departed from the Lord and change. Turn back to the Lord and he'll pardon us. Verse 42, he says, you have not pardoned us. Why? Because they haven't turned back. If they would turn back to the Lord, then he would pardon. But they continue in their transgression, they continue in their rebellion, and therefore they do not have the pardon of God. Chapter 4. Lamentations 4 starts this way. How the gold has become dim. How changed the fine gold. Chapter 4 is a lament about the siege that was brought upon Jerusalem. The things that once were of value, that once people cherished, at this point were despised and worthless. And so as we go through chapter 4, verse 1, the glitter of the gold has diminished. You know, when you can't do anything with it, there's nothing to buy with it. You know, it seems very odd to be starving and wear a nice gold chain around your neck. The value of it has diminished. Still in verse 1, the stones of the sanctuary, they're scattered out in the streets. Verse 2, the people who once were precious and priceless, like fine gold, he says they're now more like worn out clay pots. There's no glory within the nation. Verse 3 and 4, children were not cared for by their mothers as they ought to. You know, the maternal instinct that we should expect to find. And he even says you're going to find it in the wildest of beasts. Even the jackals present their breast to nurse their young, but the daughter of my people is cruel, like ostriches in the wild. There's not a shred of humanity in the way that the mothers were treating their children. Jeremiah says, like the ostrich. I hadn't a clue what he meant by that, so I went and found out, okay, what does an ostrich do? And so this is from the website aboutwildanimals.com. Ostrich hens are not overly concerned about their eggs. These are gathered into a communal nest, but some are left outside. When ostriches sense danger, they temporarily abandon their eggs or chicks. Out of here, see ya. And now, the ostrich has a reason, you know, and it's the appearance that looks really bad. The ostrich is actually doing something good. But these weren't. The people in Judah were not. What the ostrich is doing, let's not be overly critical at first. She abandons the eggs of the chicks so she can distract the attacker. That's what she's doing. And she'll actually play as though she's injured to try and draw the attacker away. And so she is preserving her young. But it's the appearance. The initial appearance is what Jeremiah is focused on. It's like she doesn't care for her young. She just, enemies there. Oh, I'm out of here. I'm leaving. That's what the women in Judah were like. They abandoned their children. And it was for self-preservation. Had nothing to do with the good of their children. It was for self-preservation. In fact, down at verse 10, they abandoned this maternal instinct to the point of cooking and consuming their own children. That's how drastic things got in Judah. Verse 5, those who were once wealthy, the rich, who once ate delicacies, now they lay desolate in the streets. Verse 9, the statement is made that it would be better to be slain by the sword, because at least if you're slain by the sword, you die immediately, rather than those who died of hunger in the streets. The siege was difficult. Now, the question is why? Why would the Lord allow all of this to come upon his people? Notice verse 11, the Lord has fulfilled his fury. He has poured out his fierce anger. He has kindled a fire in Zion, and it has devoured its foundations. Again, it says, and the Lord fulfilled what he set out to do. This was God's will. Well, why? Verse 12, the kings of the earth and all the inhabitants of the world would not have believed that the adversary and the enemy could enter the gates of Jerusalem because of the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests, who shed in her midst the blood of the just. It's acknowledged in verse 12, Judah's neighbors would never have believed that the walls and the gates of Jerusalem would ever be penetrated by an enemy. They knew that these were the people of God, and God was at their defense. About 150 years before this, Assyria had attacked Israel in the north, and it was God's plan for him to do so. Israel had completely left the things of God. Israel was devastated by Assyria. Sennacherib decides he's going to go south and come up against Jerusalem. He camps his army on a hillside opposite of Jerusalem, ready to attack the next day. He's got 185,000 men at his disposal. The next morning, 185,000 men were dead. The Lord killed the Assyrian army. Not one man out of Jerusalem had come out to fight against them. The Lord fought for them and destroyed the Assyrian army that came up against them. And so for the city to be sieged and taken in this manner, all of the enemies of Judah would conclude the Lord's hand is in this. There's no other way that they could fall the way that they've fallen. Verse 13, it associates it with their religious leaders, leading them into sin. Verse 16 talks about the Lord scattering them from their homeland because they had no respect for the priests or for the elders. They don't listen to authority. Verse 17, Jeremiah indicates that they were looking for deliverance from a nation that never came. That was Egypt. They needed to turn to God. Finally, chapter 5. Chapter 5 is a lament seeking restoration. It starts this way in verse 1. Remember, O Lord, what has come upon us. Look and behold our reproach. Lord, remember us, because we've fallen from our esteemed place. They were the people God claimed as his own. They were established in the promised land. They were given great things within that land, houses that they did not build and vineyards that they did not plant. And they threw it all away in the pursuit of paganism and selfishness. So now Jeremiah, on behalf of the people, remember us, Lord. Remember where we've fallen from. Verse 2, our inheritance and our houses are occupied by strangers now. Verse 3, we're a nation of orphans and widows. Most of their men have been put to death. Verse 4, we don't own our own resources anymore. Verse 4, what they have to do, we pay for the water we drink, and our wood comes at a price. Imagine that. They're needing to pay for all these things that once belonged to them. Verse 5, we serve as slaves. In fact, they have servants ruling over them in verse 8. Verse 6, he says, we've sold ourselves out in hopes of finding allies to help us. Again, Egypt didn't happen. Verse 9 through 10, we have pestilence and famine and disease among us. Verse 11, our women are being stolen away. Verse 12, our leaders have been executed. Here's how bad things have got for the people of Judah. Life was very different. Look at verse 14 through 16. The joy is gone. The elders have ceased gathering at the gate, and the young men from their music. The joy of our heart has ceased. Our dance has turned into mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. Sin will destroy life. Sin takes away joy. It gives temporary pleasure, but it takes away joy. And it will destroy a nation as it did with them. They went from a glorious people to a scattered and tattered people. That's what sin did. And so joy is gone from their hearts. Sin has destroyed them. The book closes with an appeal for restoration. Verse 19 through 22. You, O Lord, remain forever. We're destroyed right now, but you, Lord, remain forever. Your throne from generation to generation. Why do you forget us forever and forsake us for so long a time? Turn us back to you, O Lord, and we will be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are very angry with us. They acknowledge God still rules. Even when his people are not what they ought to be, God still rules. Even when they are captives in Babylon, God still rules. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar learned that, Daniel chapter 4. As much as it felt like he had forgotten them, that's not what happened. They had forgotten him. And he warned them about it. It was in the law. He warned them that they'll come into this land and they'll forget the Lord who brought them there. And they did. The judgment that they were enduring was evidence that he hadn't forgotten them, because he's doing exactly what he told them he would do. And so now they need to seek renewal. They need to seek cleansing. Why do you forget us forever and forsake us for so long a time? Jeremiah actually told them the time. It'll be 70 years. Go off to Babylon. You'll be there 70 years. And then God will reestablish your people in the land. And so they needed to turn back. Jeremiah has vented his grief in this book. But at the same time, he's acknowledged that the punishment is just. God is always just. And what can we take from Lamentations? Couple of things. First of all, God is serious about sin. It's not something that God looks upon and says, that doesn't matter. God is serious about sin. He was patient with them for a long time, but then eventually judgment had to come. He's patient with us. He's not willing that folks perish, but eventually a judgment comes. And so he wants us to make ready for that time. We need to not imitate their wicked example, because it brought destruction. We need to imitate those who are faithful to the Lord. And then a portion of text to keep in mind, what I've got here on the board for our closing. Chapter 3, verse 22 beginning. Though the Lord's through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. That needs to be what we do. For me, that's the true takeaway from Lamentations, is that if we will focus on God, if we will wait for him and seek him and hope in him, that the end result is the salvation of our souls. They had turned from that. God sought to turn them back to that.